He was a highly ambitious, arrogant social climber who highly toxically treated his heavily pregnant, beautiful wife exactly like a highly pathetic, outdated asset. At the absolute most highly exclusive, elite red carpet event entirely of the massive year, directly in front entirely of hundreds, entirely of highly aggressive cameras, he highly publicly humiliated her, highly proudly parading his highly glamorous, brand new actress mistress exactly as his highly official upgrade. He genuinely, toxically, thought he was completely, violently discarding a highly pathetic, penniless nobody. He possessed absolutely zero microscopic idea that the exact quiet wife he literally just violently destroyed was officially, secretly, the absolute sole heir entirely to a $50 billion massive global empire. And exactly when her highly terrifying billionaire father highly unexpectedly steps completely out, entirely of the dark shadows, directly onto exactly that highly public stage, the highly catastrophic, brutal revenge absolutely doesn't entirely just completely ruin the arrogant husband. It completely, violently annihilates his absolute entire massive existence entirely in exactly less than 10 agonizing minutes. Welcome back to the channel, my beautiful family. If you fiercely believe that absolute karma always successfully collects its highly massive debts, and you absolutely love highly explosive stories of ultimate revenge and pure resilience, you absolutely must hear this incredible story. Please smash that like button to strongly support our content, subscribe to our channel, and let me know exactly what you would do if your partner humiliated you in public in the comments below. Let's get directly into The Billionaire's Secret Daughter, Part 1, The Gilded Cage. Isabella highly tragically genuinely believed that she was absolutely another highly pathetic trophy wife. In highly absolute reality, she was officially the highly secret heiress, entirely to a highly terrifying, massive empire that she literally didn't absolutely even completely imagine highly actively existed. Just highly vividly imagine the highly explosive scene. You are confidently standing perfectly on the highly exclusive red carpet entirely of the absolute most highly anticipated, elite social event entirely in massive Sao Paulo or New York/London. Highly impeccably produced, heavily pregnant, and beautifully radiant. The highly aggressive cameras violently flashing, the highly frantic photographers loudly screaming your beautiful name. And highly suddenly, your highly arrogant husband smoothly turns directly to you and explicitly says the absolute most highly cruel, toxic heavy words entirely of your entire massive life directly in front, entirely of absolutely everyone. Exactly. That is exactly, precisely exactly what completely violently happened completely to Isabella exactly that highly terrifying night that completely violently changed absolutely everything. Let's highly aggressively begin completely from the absolute beginning. Because exactly this highly epic story officially possesses significantly more highly explosive twists than a highly dramatic primetime soap opera. Isabella was peacefully sitting entirely in the highly luxurious back seat, entirely of a highly expensive Rolls-Royce. Her soft, highly protective hand gently resting perfectly on her exactly 6-month pregnant massive belly. The highly expensive French silk designer dress had highly easily cost an absolute massive fortune. But perfectly right, perfectly there, entirely in exactly that highly agonizing moment. It physically felt significantly more exactly like a highly pathetic costume, a highly fake character outfit that she was highly aggressively forced entirely to highly pathetically interpret perfectly by her soft side. Elliot, her highly ambitious husband, intensely looked completely out the highly tinted window, completely with exactly that highly toxic expression that she intimately knew way too incredibly well. It was officially his highly specific face completely before highly massive public humiliations. Isabella, for the absolute love entirely of God, sit highly properly, he highly toxically muttered, completely without absolutely even actively looking entirely at her. You are completely, highly pathetically slouched, completely over. It highly pathetically actively makes the highly expensive designer dress visually look exactly like highly cheap street garbage, and exactly that massive belly, my absolute God. Imagine clearly hearing exactly that completely from the true biological father entirely of your innocent child. Isabella physically felt her soft hand aggressively squeeze her massive belly significantly tighter. Elliot, I am heavily pregnant. My fragile back violently aches. Absolutely always, completely with the highly pathetic, cheap excuses. He heavily sighed, finally smoothly turning directly toward her completely, with those piercing, freezing eyes. I highly expensively paid a highly massive fortune entirely for exactly that designer dress. The absolute bare minimum you can highly possibly actively do is highly properly, flawlessly wear it. And the highly expensive diamond necklace is completely crooked. She highly gently brought her soft hand directly to her delicate neck, highly nervously adjusting the highly expensive diamond necklace that physically felt significantly more exactly like a highly heavy, luxurious dog collar. Is it perfectly fine exactly now, Elliot? No, it absolutely is not perfectly fine. He violently cut her completely off completely, with exactly that highly venomous, toxic tone that she intimately knew way too incredibly well. Absolutely nothing is absolutely ever, ever perfectly fine, completely with you. Absolutely is it. We absolutely are not highly mediocre, pathetic people, Isabella. We are completely, utterly exceptional, or highly significantly, more accurately. I officially am. You, exactly today, are absolutely just a highly pathetic reflection entirely of me. And exactly that highly pathetic reflection absolutely must be completely, utterly perfect. What exact specific level entirely of highly toxic psychopathy is exactly this? Isabella violently bit her soft lip entirely, to highly aggressively stop completely from violently crying. Exactly this was officially their highly toxic daily routine, completely before absolutely any highly public event. He highly systematically, completely, violently destroyed her fragile self-esteem, highly meticulously, piece completely, by highly pathetic piece completely, until she completely, violently transformed completely into a highly obedient, pathetic doll, perfectly on his strong arm. Way too incredibly highly nervous entirely to actively speak, or highly actively do absolutely anything that could highly possibly actively ruin his highly massive show. And she had highly tragically fiercely fallen, completely, utterly entirely in pure love, completely, with exactly this highly toxic man. Exactly 2 agonizing years completely prior, he was absolute, pure toxic charm, blindingly ambitious, highly intoxicating. She, a highly simple, beautiful girl who brutally worked entirely in a highly modest art gallery, was completely, utterly dazzled. Her highly protective father, Arthur, had highly seriously warned her completely from the absolute first massive day. "He is officially a highly pathetic peacock, my beautiful daughter," Arthur had highly seriously spoken completely from his highly quiet, modest landline, entirely in the highly distant countryside. Absolutely only highly fake facade, completely without absolutely any highly solid substance. A highly arrogant man who highly desperately needs to highly toxically appear exactly that, incredibly much, is highly maliciously actively hiding absolutely something highly incredibly ugly. Isabella highly foolishly completely ignored him. She was fiercely entirely in pure love. Now, completely, violently, trapped entirely in exactly this highly terrifying gilded cage. The highly heavy words entirely of her highly protective father loudly echoed completely in her brilliant mind, exactly like a highly terrifying, absolute prophecy. The highly expensive car finally smoothly stopped. The highly deafening roar entirely of the highly massive crowd and the highly blinding sudden flash entirely of highly aggressive cameras flawlessly filled the heavy space. A highly uniformed elite staff member smoothly opened the heavy door entirely for Elliot. He confidently stepped completely out. Completely. With exactly that. Fake, $1 million toxic smile that he highly instantly flawlessly materialized completely for the highly aggressive camera crews. He smoothly extended his strong hand completely back directly into the expensive car. Absolutely not entirely for her, but entirely for the highly aggressive photographers. Absolute pure theater. When she gently took his strong hand and confidently stepped completely out entirely of the expensive car, the highly blinding flashes violently intensified. You could highly clearly hear the highly aggressive reporters loudly screaming their names. "Elliot! Mr. Vance! Perfectly right here! Isabella! You visually look absolutely beautiful!" For exactly one highly brief second, beautifully bathed entirely in exactly that highly bright artificial light, she profoundly felt a highly tiny, microscopic prick entirely of pure hope. Perhaps exactly tonight would absolutely be completely different. Perhaps the highly magical magic entirely of the highly exclusive event. The pure joy entirely of the innocent baby they were highly happily expecting would miraculously soften him. Elliot smoothly leaned significantly closer, his warm lips highly intimately brushing her delicate ear. The highly toxic smile absolutely did not violently waver entirely for a highly single microscopic second, exactly as he highly toxically whispered, "Deeply remember exactly what I highly explicitly told you. Highly toxically smile, highly pathetically wave, and absolutely do not actively speak absolutely anything, absolutely, unless they highly explicitly ask you. Your highly pathetic opinions absolutely are not exactly what they highly desperately want to clearly hear." The highly fragile hope completely, violently, died entirely in the highly exact same massive second. The highly expensive diamonds perfectly on her delicate neck physically seemed to highly suddenly violently weigh an absolute massive ton. He confidently guided her directly to the highly exclusive red carpet, his strong hand incredibly firm and highly possessively perfectly on her fragile back. She was absolutely just his highly pathetic accessory, the highly impeccably dressed pathetic surrogate. And exactly tonight, she was actively going to highly pathetically fulfill the highly toxic role. Elliot treats Isabella like a prop. What would you do if your partner spoke to you this way in public? Tell us below. Part 2. The public execution. The highly exclusive red carpet was an absolute, massive river, entirely of highly deep crimson and bright gold, beautifully running directly toward the highly illuminated grand entrance, entirely of the massive museum. A highly bloody battlefield, entirely of highly expensive designer brands, massive influence, and highly toxic ego. Every single highly deliberate step was a highly calculated pose. Every single highly intense glance, a highly toxic calculation. Isabella had highly painfully learned exactly how to highly successfully navigate exactly this. To flawlessly maintain the highly fake smile, absolutely, even exactly when her swollen feet violently ached, and her beautiful spirit completely, violently withered. But exactly tonight, the heavy air was incredibly different. There was a highly explosive tension entirely in the heavy air that physically felt significantly more highly malevolent. When they completely stopped entirely for the highly massive main bank, entirely of aggressive photographers, he aggressively tightened his highly toxic control completely on her. Smoothly turn a highly tiny bit directly to the absolute left, Isabella. It is officially your significantly better side, he highly toxically commanded, incredibly softly. She highly submissively obeyed, the highly blinding flashes violently bursting completely in her piercing eyes, exactly like highly tiny, bright explosions. It was entirely in exactly that highly specific moment, entirely of highly blinding light, that she vividly saw it, confidently exiting completely from a highly sleek black Maserati, perfectly right, perfectly directly behind their highly expensive Rolls-Royce, was officially Chloe Decker. Chloe was officially the highly absolute, brand new, elite darling, entirely of the highly aggressive media. A highly ambitious, incredibly sensual elite actress who had highly successfully landed a highly coveted leading role entirely in a highly massive blockbuster flawlessly produced completely by a highly massive company, entirely in which Elliot had highly recently, massively invested. She was absolutely everything that Isabella absolutely was not. Highly audacious, shamelessly, incredibly sexy, highly aggressively radiating a highly toxic confidence that violently bordered completely on absolute arrogance. She was absolutely also the exact beautiful woman whose highly expensive perfume violently clung completely to the bespoke clothes entirely of Elliot, entirely for the absolute last exactly 3 agonizing months. The massive heart entirely of Isabella violently raced. She highly toxically suspected, absolutely, of course, the highly suspicious corporate meetings that highly suspiciously extended completely deep, completely into the pitch-black dawn. The highly hushed, secret phone calls entirely in the massive office. The highly sudden, highly expensive gifts that physically seemed significantly more exactly like highly pathetic bribery, entirely for her highly absolute silence. She had highly bravely attempted to actively confront him exactly once, and he had highly maliciously thrown the highly toxic blame completely on her, completely with a highly terrifying, absolute precision. Are you highly maliciously accusing me entirely of absolutely anything, Isabella? It is officially the highly pathetic pregnancy that is actively making you incredibly paranoid and highly hysterical. I am perfectly out, perfectly there, highly aggressively, building a massive empire entirely for us, entirely for our innocent child. And you are perfectly here, entirely at home, highly generously letting your highly pathetic imagination violently run, completely wild. Be incredibly grateful. Absolutely not highly suspicious. He had highly successfully actively made her profoundly feel incredibly small and highly ridiculous. Now, vividly seeing Chloe Decker completely in highly actual flesh and pure blood, confidently entering the highly exact same exclusive red carpet. A highly dazzling, beautiful vision, entirely in a highly scandalously low-cut emerald designer dress. Isabella profoundly knew that the highly terrifying suspicions absolutely were not highly pathetic paranoia. Exactly that was an absolute, highly pathetic understatement. The piercing eyes entirely of Chloe violently met absolutely those entirely of Elliot, completely over the fragile shoulder entirely of Isabella. A highly slow, incredibly triumphant, toxic smile beautifully spread completely across her beautiful face. Exactly this, absolutely, was not a highly pathetic coincidence. It was a highly meticulously planned, explosive detonation. Elliot highly gently gave a highly firm, toxic little push completely to Isabella, smoothly moving them completely down the highly aggressive press line. Highly aggressively continue actively walking, he highly toxically whispered. His deep voice, highly dangerously smooth. They were highly aggressively intercepted completely by Amelia Vance, no relation. A highly famous elite social columnist completely from the highly prominent local newspaper. Her highly toxic smile was exactly as incredibly sharp, exactly as her expensive pen. Elliot! Isabella! The highly absolute couple entirely of the beautiful night. Isabella. The beautiful pregnancy has highly miraculously made you incredibly radiant. You are an absolute, pure glow. Before Isabella could highly successfully politely thank her, Elliot laughed loudly. It was a highly loud, incredibly dismissive toxic sound that highly aggressively attracted the highly intense attention entirely of absolutely everyone, perfectly nearby. She absolutely is highly miraculously glowing, Amelia, he stated, his piercing eyes brilliantly shining completely with highly pure malice. It is completely, utterly incredible. Exactly what a highly few, short extra kilograms can highly successfully actively do. I highly constantly actively keep explicitly telling her that we will absolutely desperately need to highly expensively hire an elite team entirely of the absolute best highly elite personal trainers, entirely in the massive world, entirely, to miraculously get her completely back, completely into highly perfect shape, completely after the innocent baby is miraculously born. A highly elite Vance absolutely must, absolutely always, completely be incredibly impeccable. Right, my beautiful love? What exact specific kind entirely of highly brutal, low blow is exactly this? The highly toxic comment violently hit her, exactly like a highly brutal physical punch. The heavy air violently crackled. The piercing eyes entirely of Amelia completely, violently widened. Highly astutely, smelling a highly massive, explosive story. The highly aggressive reporters and elite photographers aggressively began to confidently approach significantly closer. The highly massive microphones exactly like a highly dark forest entirely of black poles. The beautiful face entirely of Isabella violently burned completely with absolute humiliation. He had absolutely never, ever been so incredibly, highly openly cruel completely before. She highly desperately attempted to violently free her soft arm completely from his strong grip. but the highly toxic hold was exactly like solid iron. "Elliot, please," she whispered incredibly softly, her beautiful voice violently trembling. He completely, utterly ignored her, and exactly that was exactly when Chloe Decker highly smoothly glided directly up completely to them. The highly expensive perfume entirely of exotic jasmine, and absolutely something highly musky, flawlessly enveloping absolutely everyone. "Elliot, my beautiful darling," she highly seductively purred, gently placing a highly perfectly manicured soft hand perfectly on his broad arm. Perfectly right, perfectly next, completely to Isabella. "I was highly impatiently waiting entirely to vividly see you." The highly toxic smile entirely of Elliot violently widened. He smoothly turned his broad body incredibly slightly, flawlessly creating a highly intimate space entirely for Chloe that highly subtly, but completely deliberately, highly ruthlessly excluded his absolute own, heavily pregnant wife. "Chloe, you are visually looking completely, utterly magnificent, a highly true, absolute star, and exactly you, Isabella," Chloe stated, her piercing gaze highly toxically sweeping the highly heavy pregnant form entirely of Isabella, completely with a highly toxic expression, entirely of highly pitiful disdain. "How incredibly domestic. It is incredibly brave, entirely to confidently go completely out entirely in your highly pathetic condition." The massive world aggressively began to violently spin. The highly blinding, flashing lights. The highly loud murmur entirely of the massive crowd. The highly suffocating, expensive perfume entirely of Chloe. Absolutely all completely, violently turning completely into a highly nauseating, highly dizzying toxic vortex. Elliot was highly actively delighting entirely in the highly intense attention, highly eagerly absorbing absolutely all entirely of it. Exactly this was officially his highly malicious plan. Exactly this was officially the highly public execution entirely of their beautiful marriage. He was highly actively upgrading, and he highly desperately wanted the absolute entire massive world entirely to highly publicly witness the highly exact, precise moment, exactly when he highly ruthlessly discarded the highly pathetic old model entirely for the highly glamorous brand new exactly one. The highly aggressive microphone entirely of Amelia Vance was perfectly right, exactly, perfectly there. "Elliot, you and Miss Decker visually seem incredibly highly close. Is exactly this officially a highly strict business relationship?" Elliot highly loudly let completely out absolutely another highly thunderous toxic laugh. He highly aggressively dropped the soft arm entirely of Isabella and smoothly passed his massive arm completely over the highly exposed shoulders entirely of Chloe. The highly aggressive cameras completely, violently, went entirely into an absolute frenzy. The highly explosive image would absolutely be completely on absolutely every single highly sleazy website entirely in highly short minutes. Elliot Vance completely with his strong arm, perfectly on his highly glamorous mistress entirely, while his highly pathetic pregnant wife highly pathetically stood completely forgotten perfectly on the absolute side. Chloe is officially a highly talented, elite visionary, Elliot highly proudly announced, his deep voice flawlessly projecting completely into absolutely every single highly aggressive microphone. "In my highly elite corporate business, you absolutely must highly successfully align completely yourself, completely with the massive future. You absolutely cannot highly pathetically safely stay completely, violently tied completely to highly pathetic, outdated assets. He absolutely did not actively look entirely at Isabella. But absolutely everyone profoundly knew exactly about who he was highly actively talking. Highly pathetic, outdated asset. The highly heavy words loudly echoed completely in the highly deep cavern, entirely of her massive shock. Her blurred vision completely, violently, blurred completely with hot tears that she fiercely refused to highly generously let violently fall. She profoundly felt exactly hundreds entirely of piercing pairs, entirely of eyes, completely on her. A highly toxic mixture, entirely of pathetic pity and highly morbid curiosity. They were highly attentively watching her completely, violently, crumble. She cowardly took exactly one massive step, completely backward. Then absolutely another. Absolutely no one highly astutely noticed. Absolutely all piercing eyes were completely, violently glued entirely to Elliot and Chloe, the highly glamorous brand new power couple, happily laughing and highly proudly posing entirely for the highly rabid, aggressive press. She was completely invisible, a highly pathetic ghost entirely in her absolute own highly public execution, with a highly choked, massive sob violently stuck entirely in her dry throat. Isabella smoothly turned completely around and frantically fled. She highly aggressively pushed her highly desperate way completely through the highly gaping, curious onlookers, completely ignoring the highly astonished, loud screams entirely of absolutely some highly aggressive reporters who finally highly astutely noticed her highly sudden departure. She violently stumbled completely off the highly exclusive red carpet, her highly expensive heels violently sinking completely into the highly wet grass entirely of the massive park. She absolutely only highly desperately wanted to completely, permanently disappear. She frantically pulled completely out her expensive phone, her soft hands violently trembling so incredibly, highly much that she could literally barely successfully dial the highly secure number. There was officially absolutely only exactly one single, highly powerful person entirely, in the absolute entire massive world, that she could highly safely call. The highly secure phone loudly rang exactly twice, completely before he highly smoothly answered. His deep voice was incredibly grave and highly calm. "Bella, what exactly happened?" "Dad!" she violently gasped, the hot tears finally completely, violently breaking completely free, incredibly hot and highly shameful, completely down her pale face. Can you highly possibly confidently come safely pick me completely up? Please? Absolutely something highly terrible has completely violently happened." There was a highly pregnant pause completely on the absolute other side, entirely of the highly secure line. And entirely and exactly that highly heavy silence. Isabella could highly clearly physically feel an absolute entire, massive lifetime entirely of highly quiet, paternal pure fury aggressively beginning to completely, violently condense. "Where exactly are you actively located, Bella?" The deep voice entirely of Arthur Sinclair was highly dangerously, terrifyingly low. "Highly explicitly tell me exactly where you are actively located right exactly now." Isabella just called her secret billionaire dad. What do you think his first move will be? Tell us your predictions. Part 3. The awakening of the Titan guys. Exactly here is exactly where the highly explosive story completely, violently gets absolutely insane. Absolutely, because Arthur Sinclair absolutely was not a highly normal man. highly prone entirely to highly open, dramatic demonstrations entirely of pure emotion. His highly exclusive world was entirely of highly quiet, absolute control, highly calculated, massive moves, and completely unspoken, terrifying, absolute power. He quietly lived entirely in a highly imposing, but incredibly discreet, massive stone mansion, completely in the highly distant countryside. An absolute entire massive world, completely away, completely from the highly blinding flash and the highly loud clamor, entirely of massive Sao Paulo or New York. He highly fiercely preferred the highly quiet company entirely of his highly expensive, purebred horses and his highly loyal dog, a highly elegant retired greyhound explicitly named Odin, completely over the highly pathetic sycophants and highly toxic sharks entirely of the highly elite corporate business world. He had highly successfully built his highly massive empire, Sinclair Global, completely from exactly one single, highly simple delivery truck, completely into a multi-billion-dollar massive logistics behemoth, completely by actively being significantly smarter, significantly faster, and significantly more highly ruthless than absolutely anyone completely else. And then, exactly 10 agonizing years completely ago, he highly apparently completely, mysteriously, vanished, highly smoothly passing the highly complex day-to-day operations completely over directly to a highly trusted elite board of directors, and miraculously becoming exactly one entirely of the absolute most highly elusive, secret billionaires entirely in the massive world. The massive world profoundly knew the highly terrifying name Sinclair Global. They absolutely did not completely know the highly specific name Arthur Sinclair. He had highly expensively paid entirely to completely, permanently erase his highly absolute presence, completely from absolutely all highly public records. Completely with the exact same highly brutal, absolute efficiency that he highly ruthlessly applied entirely in a highly hostile corporate acquisition. He highly actively did exactly it, entirely for exactly one highly specific reason: to fiercely protect Isabella. After his highly beloved wife, Helena, was highly tragically killed entirely in a highly suspicious car accident that Arthur absolutely always highly correctly suspected was an absolute, highly targeted attack, completely by a highly ruthless business rival. He fiercely swore entirely to highly aggressively keep his beautiful daughter completely out, entirely of the highly dangerous crosshairs entirely of his massive wealth. She beautifully grew completely up, completely with highly comfortable comfort, but completely without highly extravagant extravagance. She confidently went directly to highly excellent schools, but absolutely not directly to the highly elite, exclusive institutions entirely of the super rich. She profoundly knew that her loving father was highly successful, but successfully possessed absolutely zero highly massive concept entirely of the highly terrifying scale. She highly genuinely thought he was absolutely just a highly simple, pathetic logistics consultant. It was a highly massive lie, beautifully born, completely out, entirely of pure love and blinding fear. When he highly generously gave Isabella a highly generous, but absolutely not highly extravagant, massive trust fund entirely for her beautiful marriage, completely to Elliot. He absolutely also highly meticulously conducted the absolute most highly exhaustive, complete background investigation that massive money could highly possibly buy. He highly horrifyingly discovered that Elliot Vance absolutely was not a highly successful real estate magnate. He was an absolute highly pathetic fraud. His highly pathetic company, Vance Properties, was a highly fragile house entirely of highly cheap cards, completely supported entirely by highly toxic, high-interest loans, and a highly massive series entirely of highly brilliant toxic lies. Significantly, more highly damning, a highly significant massive portion entirely of his highly initial seed money had absolutely been highly secretly channeled completely from a highly secure shell company entirely of Sinclair Global. A highly elaborate trap that Arthur had highly meticulously created entirely to highly effectively test his highly anticipated future son-in-law. Elliot absolutely did not entirely just highly eagerly fall completely for the highly toxic bait. He highly arrogantly leveraged it completely to the absolute hilt, highly genuinely believing it was a highly anonymous, massive investment, completely from a highly distant foreign fund. He was entirely in highly absolute essence, completely, utterly financed completely by the exact same highly quiet man that he highly toxically mocked exactly as highly pathetic and provincial. Arthur highly securely kept exactly this highly explosive information completely to himself, highly desperately hoping that Isabella would highly eventually vividly see the absolute truth completely on her absolute own. He highly patiently waited. Now, exactly that highly patient waiting had completely, permanently ended. The absolute precise moment he clearly heard the highly broken, beautiful voice entirely of Isabella, completely on the highly secure phone. The highly freezing, highly controlled, massive dam that Arthur had highly meticulously built, completely around his fragile heart, entirely for agonizing decades, completely, violently, cracked. The absolute fury that violently poured completely out was a highly silent, highly terrifying glacial force. Safely. Stay exactly where you absolutely are, Bela. Do absolutely not safely leave. I am highly urgently sending a highly armored car, he stated, his deep voice a highly low, terrifying growl. And I am highly actively listening highly personally. He violently hung completely up and highly aggressively pressed a highly secure button completely on his massive desk intercom. Marcos, he stated, his deep voice generously leaving absolutely zero highly pathetic room entirely for highly toxic discussion. Highly urgently prepare the highly massive helicopter. Absolute destination, massive Sao Paulo or New York. Exactly now. And highly urgently get me a highly secure live broadcast completely from the highly exclusive red carpet entirely of the massive event. I highly fiercely want to vividly see absolutely everything. In highly short minutes, the highly quiet living room entirely of his highly quiet country house was completely, violently transformed completely into a highly advanced command center. A highly massive, glowing screen perfectly on the hard wall brilliantly flickered directly to absolute life, flawlessly showing highly live footage completely from a highly popular news feed. He vividly saw absolutely everything. He vividly saw his highly beautiful, heavily pregnant daughter, confidently standing completely, utterly alone. He vividly saw Elliot Vance, his strong arm highly proudly hanging completely from exactly that highly pathetic actress, exactly like a highly cheap, pathetic trophy. He vividly saw the highly toxic whispers, the highly aggressive stares, the highly smug, toxic triumph entirely on the handsome face, entirely of Elliot. He highly intensely watched the highly tragic footage, entirely of his beautiful daughter frantically fleeing. And absolutely something highly massive completely inside him, completely, violently turned completely to freezing ice. His highly terrifying head of security, a highly formidable former elite agent, explicitly named Marcos, safely stood perfectly in highly absolute silence. The highly armored car entirely for Mrs. Vance is highly actively leaving entirely in exactly 5 short minutes. The highly massive helicopter is completely ready, entirely on the highly secure tarmac. Arthur absolutely did not actively take his piercing eyes completely off the bright screen. He was exactly now completely inside the highly exclusive event, loudly laughing completely with a highly elite group entirely of massive men. Chloe Decker highly securely glued directly to his broad arm. He visually looked exactly like the highly arrogant king entirely of the massive world. Highly aggressively change the highly secure route entirely of my expensive car, Arthur stated, his deep voice incredibly flat. I am absolutely not actively going directly to the highly secure meeting point. I am actively going directly to the highly exclusive event. Marcos violently hesitated entirely for a highly microscopic fraction, entirely of a second. Sir, your highly strict security protocol, Arthur violently cut him completely off. Highly urgently call David Brown entirely for me. David Brown was officially the highly elite CEO entirely of Sinclair Global, the highly official public face entirely of the massive company. He absolutely also officially sat perfectly on the highly elite board entirely of the massive museum that highly proudly hosted the highly exclusive event. A highly few short moments significantly later, the highly flustered, terrified voice entirely of Brown confidently came completely through the highly secure speakerphone. Arthur, is absolutely everything perfectly fine? I am actively entirely in the highly exclusive event right exactly now. David, Arthur stated, his deep voice exactly like the highly terrifying grinding entirely of massive tectonic plates. You are actively going to confidently walk directly up completely to the highly elite event coordinator. You are actively going to highly explicitly tell them that entirely in exactly 10 short minutes, I'm actively going to confidently step completely onto the massive stage. They are actively going to completely, violently interrupt the highly current speaker, and they are actively going to highly politely give me a highly functional microphone. There is absolutely no highly pathetic room entirely for highly toxic discussion. Do you completely understand? There was a highly stunned, dead silence completely on the absolute other side. David Brown profoundly knew that Arthur Sinclair had absolutely not highly actively made a highly public appearance, entirely insignificantly, over an agonizing decade. For him to highly actively do exactly this, right exactly now, completely without absolutely any highly polite warning. In the absolute most highly high-profile, exclusive event, entirely, of the massive year, absolutely something completely, violently, seismic, was highly actively happening. Yes, Arthur, completely understood. Arthur confidently stood completely up, flawlessly wearing a highly simple, incredibly impeccably tailored dark jacket perfectly over his highly expensive cashmere sweater. He visually looked completely out entirely of highly pathetic place, entirely for a highly exclusive black tie event. But he profoundly knew that entirely, in a highly few short minutes, absolutely, no one was actively going to highly pathetically care exactly what he was highly actively wearing. He confidently walked completely out entirely of the highly quiet room, completely without actively looking completely back. Odin the Greyhound, highly quietly, confidently, standing completely up, entirely, to highly silently follow him directly to the heavy door, as he highly aggressively marched directly toward the massive helicopter, highly impatiently waiting entirely for the highly rhythmic, loud beating, entirely of the highly massive propellers violently beating completely against the highly freezing night air. He absolutely wasn't entirely just a highly protective father, confidently coming entirely to miraculously rescue his beautiful daughter. He was an absolute emperor, highly aggressively marching directly to massive war. Elliot Vance had highly arrogantly built his highly pathetic tiny kingdom completely on highly fragile sand, highly illegally, using the massive money entirely of Arthur Sinclair, and completely, violently, breaking the fragile heart entirely of his beautiful daughter, entirely in the highly toxic process. Arthur was actively about to completely, violently unleash the absolute entire massive ocean. Arthur Sinclair is heading to the gala to destroy Elliot. What do you think he's going to say on stage? Drop your predictions below. Part 4. The Annihilation. The highly grand main hall entirely of the massive art museum was an absolute, highly deafening symphony entirely of highly elegant clinking champagne glasses, highly polite, fake laughter, and the highly toxic hum entirely of highly elite self-congratulation entirely of the absolute highest elite entirely of the massive city. A highly powerful senator was peacefully standing perfectly at the highly imposing podium, highly eloquently discoursing entirely about highly noble philanthropic duty. Elliot Vance was completely, utterly, in his highly absolute element, highly arrogantly commanding perfectly near the highly exclusive main bar. He successfully possessed Chloe perfectly on exactly one strong arm and a highly expensive glass entirely of vintage Dom Perignon entirely in his massive hand. He profoundly felt completely, utterly, untouchable. The highly tearful, pathetic exit entirely of Isabella had absolutely been a highly minor, completely confusing detail, highly easily, flawlessly transformed, completely into a highly toxic narrative, entirely of a highly emotional, pregnant woman, highly pathetically, actively having a highly pathetic moment. He was absolutely already highly creatively creating the highly toxic story entirely for the highly aggressive press. He was actively entirely in the absolute middle entirely of a highly self-aggrandizing toxic anecdote exactly when a highly subtle, massive shift miraculously occurred entirely in the highly heavy atmosphere entirely of the massive room. The highly powerful senator perfectly at the highly imposing podium violently faltered, intensely looking completely, utterly confused, directly toward the highly dark side entirely of the massive stage. A highly elegant man, entirely in a highly bespoke tuxedo, the highly elite event organizer, was highly urgently, actively talking completely with him. The senator nodded fiercely, visually looking incredibly perplexed, and smoothly stepped completely away, completely from the highly active microphone. Highly esteemed ladies and highly powerful gentlemen, the elite organizer stated, his deep voice incredibly tense. We officially possess a highly unscheduled, massive addition completely to our highly exclusive program. Please highly warmly welcome Mr. Arthur Sinclair. The highly terrifying name violently hung suspended completely in the heavy air, highly respectfully received completely by a highly confused, collective silence. Absolutely some highly powerful people completely from the highly elite financial and industrial sectors, highly nervously exchanged, highly perplexed, massive glances. Arthur Sinclair? The highly terrifying ghost? The highly absolute myth? It absolutely had to fiercely be a highly pathetic mistake. Then, he confidently walked directly onto the massive stage. He absolutely was not exactly what they had highly actively expected. He absolutely wasn't flawlessly wearing a highly bespoke tuxedo. He was highly simply dressed entirely in highly simple dark trousers, a highly simple sweater, and a highly simple jacket. He visually looked significantly more exactly like a highly boring university professor than a highly terrifying titan, entirely of elite industry. But he flawlessly possessed a highly terrifying aura completely around him. A highly absolute, completely unshakable gravity that violently demanded the highly absolute attention entirely of absolutely every single person, entirely. In the massive room. The massive hall completely, violently, fell completely. Utterly silent. Elliot Vance completely, violently froze. The highly expensive glass perfectly suspended entirely halfway, directly to his handsome lips. He intensely looked directly at the massive stage. The highly terrifying name violently sounded highly vaguely familiar, but he absolutely could not highly successfully place it. He had clearly heard Isabella highly casually mention that the beautiful name entirely of her loving father was Arthur, but her highly pathetic father was absolutely some highly pathetic, small logistics guy completely from the highly distant countryside. It absolutely could not highly possibly be him on the massive stage. Arthur confidently approached the highly active microphone. He absolutely did not highly gently tap it, nor highly meticulously adjust it. He simply confidently stood perfectly there, his highly piercing, freezing blue eyes aggressively scanning the highly massive crowd entirely of highly stunned faces, completely until they highly successfully found exactly what they were highly actively searching entirely for. They completely, violently locked perfectly on Elliot. "My highly official name is officially Arthur Sinclair," he confidently began, his deep voice incredibly calm and highly clear. Flawlessly amplified completely throughout the absolute entire cavernous hall. There was absolutely zero highly pathetic tremor. Absolutely zero highly toxic anger. Absolutely only the highly solid, completely hard, massive weight, entirely of highly immense, absolute power. For absolutely those who absolutely do not intimately know me, I am officially the absolute sole founder and highly absolute sole owner entirely of Sinclair Global. A highly massive wave entirely of highly loud gasps and highly frantic, toxic whispers violently rippled completely through the highly elite audience. Sinclair Global was an absolute leviathan. It highly legally owned massive ports, elite airlines, and a highly complex web entirely of highly lucrative subsidiaries, so incredibly, highly vast, that miraculously, almost absolutely, every single person, entirely in exactly that massive room, had absolutely been highly, indirectly, completely touched. Completely by its highly massive influence, the highly simple man. Perfectly on the massive stage, absolutely wasn't entirely just a highly powerful billionaire. He was an absolute kingmaker. A highly shadowy, absolute power entirely of highly mythical proportions. The hot blood entirely of Elliot, completely, violently turned completely to freezing ice. Sinclair, the highly beautiful maiden name entirely of Isabella. It absolutely could not highly possibly be. It was a highly impossible, completely absurd, pathetic coincidence. His brilliant mind frantically raced, highly desperately attempting to miraculously connect the highly complex dots. But absolutely all he could highly possibly profoundly feel was a highly rapidly rising, massive tide entirely of pure, unadulterated panic. The piercing gaze entirely of Arthur absolutely, permanently remained completely fixed perfectly on him. I am absolutely not a highly public man, entirely of highly elite public events. I am actively perfectly here, exactly today, entirely or exactly one highly specific reason. My beautiful daughter was highly publicly, violently humiliated, perfectly on the highly famous stairs, entirely of exactly this massive museum, exactly less than exactly 1 short hour, completely ago, completely by her highly arrogant husband. The highly toxic whispers completely, violently exploded directly into a highly deafening roar. Absolutely every single highly arrogant head entirely in the massive room violently turned entirely to flawlessly find Elliot, whose handsome face had completely, violently turned completely white, exactly like highly cheap chalk. Chloe Decker, highly instinctively cowardly, took exactly one massive step completely away, completely from him. Her absolute own beautiful expression, a highly toxic mask entirely of absolute horror and massive confusion. My beautiful daughter, Arthur aggressively continued, his deep voice violently cutting completely through the highly deafening noise, exactly like a highly sharp razor, is officially Isabella Vance, highly proudly formerly Isabella Sinclair, the absolute entire massive world, completely, violently, tilted perfectly on its massive axis, entirely for Elliot Vance. The massive room aggressively began to violently spin. Isabella, her highly quiet, highly boring, highly pathetic father, was officially Arthur Sinclair, the highly anonymous, secret investor, the highly massive source entirely of absolutely all his highly pathetic capital, the highly solid foundation entirely of his absolute, entire, highly fraudulent empire, was officially the exact same highly quiet man that he had absolutely been highly toxically mocking entirely for exactly 2 agonizing years. It has highly successfully come completely to my highly intense attention, Arthur stated, his deep voice smoothly dropping incredibly slightly, actively making the highly freezing words absolutely even significantly more highly impactful. That Mr. Vance has absolutely been highly arrogantly, explicitly telling absolutely everyone, highly perfectly else, that he is highly aggressively building a massive empire, a highly laudable, massive ambition. However, it is incredibly, highly important entirely to highly generously give highly absolute credit exactly where it is highly officially due. Vance Properties was highly successfully founded, highly expensively financed, and is officially, entirely for absolutely all, highly absolute intents and highly official purposes, completely, legally, owned completely by a highly massive series entirely of highly secure shell companies that highly directly report completely to ME. Mr. Vance absolutely does not highly legally possess a massive empire. He has absolutely been highly pathetically actively managing a highly small, pathetic experimental department entirely of my massive company. And exactly today, his highly pathetic position has absolutely been completely, violently terminated. The highly collective, loud gasp was incredibly sharp and highly visceral. It was a highly public, brutal execution, significantly more completely brutal and absolutely complete than absolutely anything he could highly possibly absolutely ever have highly creatively conceived. He absolutely wasn't entirely just a highly pathetic cheater. He was an absolute, highly pathetic fraud. A highly pathetic puppet whose highly fragile strings had literally just been highly publicly completely cut. Chloe Decker absolutely did not entirely just cowardly step completely away. She practically violently recoiled completely from him, exactly as if he were completely, utterly radioactive. The highly powerful men who had absolutely been highly happily, loudly laughing, completely at his highly toxic jokes, exactly short moments, completely prior, exactly now, intensely stared directly at him completely, with absolute, pure contempt. He was an absolute, highly toxic pariah. But Arthur Sinclair absolutely had not completely finished. He highly generously let the highly explosive revelation flawlessly sink completely in, highly generously letting him highly agonizingly drown entirely in the highly silent, toxic judgment entirely of his highly elite peers. Then, he flawlessly delivered the highly absolute, final fatal blow. Absolute destroyer entirely of massive worlds. I highly agonizingly spent agonizing years entirely in the highly dark shadows, entirely to fiercely protect my beautiful daughter completely from the highly heavy burdens and highly terrifying dangers entirely of my highly massive wealth. Exactly today, I highly clearly vividly see that I was completely, catastrophically wrong. The absolute greatest highly terrifying danger entirely to her was absolutely not my highly massive fortune, but a highly arrogant man who highly maliciously sought entirely to highly toxically exploit her completely without it. Exactly this completely permanently ends right exactly now. He violently paused, highly generously letting his piercing eyes flawlessly sweep the massive room. An absolute king directly addressing his highly elite court. With highly immediate absolute effect, I am highly aggressively restructuring the highly primary massive trust fund entirely of Sinclair Global. I officially possess exactly one beautiful daughter and exactly one absolute heiress. From exactly this highly specific moment completely forward, exactly 100% entirely of my highly massive controlling shares and highly extensive personal assets will absolutely be completely, legally transferred directly into her beautiful name. Isabella Sinclair is exactly now, officially, the highly absolute majority shareholder and absolute sole heir entirely to the highly massive fortune entirely of Sinclair Global. Absolutely any highly powerful man, beautiful woman, or massive corporation entirely in exactly this massive room, who highly fiercely desires entirely to highly successfully do elite business completely with my highly massive organization entirely in the massive future, would highly absolutely do incredibly well, entirely, to highly, perfectly. Remember completely with exactly who they are highly truly actively dealing. He heavily placed the expensive microphone flawlessly back into its highly secure place. He absolutely did not highly pathetically wait entirely for highly loud applause. He simply smoothly turned completely around and confidently walked completely off the massive stage, ruthlessly leaving completely behind him a highly chaotic scene entirely of absolute, pure pandemonium. Elliot Vance stood completely, utterly frozen. The highly expensive glass entirely of vintage champagne, highly smoothly slipping, completely from his completely numb fingers, and completely, violently, shattering completely on the highly polished marble floor. The highly sharp sound was completely lost, entirely in the highly deafening cacophony. He had highly desperately attempted entirely to highly ruthlessly discard his highly pathetic outdated asset. And entirely in exactly one single, highly devastating speech, her highly protective father had miraculously made Isabella Vance, completely without a single doubt, the absolute most highly powerful woman entirely in the massive room. If absolutely not entirely in the absolute entire massive city. And he, Elliot Vance, was officially significantly less than absolutely nothing. Arthur just destroyed Elliot in front of everyone. How satisfying was that? What would you say to Elliot right now? Tell us below. Part 5. The Ashes of Deceit. The highly anticipated morning completely after the highly explosive event was an absolute, massive media apocalypse. Absolutely every single highly prominent news outlet, completely from the highly prestigious financial journals, directly to the absolute most highly sleazy online tabloids, highly aggressively led completely with the highly exact same massive story. Highly stunning photos entirely of Arthur Sinclair, perfectly on the massive stage, were highly flawlessly juxtaposed, completely with the highly toxic images entirely of Elliot and Chloe, perfectly on the highly exclusive red carpet, and the highly heartbreaking, tragic photo entirely of a highly pregnant, completely lonely Isabella, frantically fleeing the highly explosive scene. The highly massive headlines violently screamed, "The highly terrifying ghost billionaire miraculously returns. Highly publicly humiliated wife miraculously inherits a massive $50 billion empire from highly public humiliation directly to the massive boardroom. The highly epic story entirely of Isabella Sinclair. The highly catastrophic, brutal downfall entirely of Elliot Vance. The highly catastrophic consequences were completely immediate and absolutely devastating. His expensive phone violently rang, completely incessantly, completely with highly panicked calls, completely from highly terrified investors, violently furious creditors, and his exactly now highly former, expensive elite lawyers. At exactly 9 a.m., completely sharp, a highly official legal letter completely from the highly elite legal team, entirely of Sinclair Global, was highly officially delivered directly to his massive office, highly officially informing him that his highly secure access completely to absolutely all highly massive company accounts was completely, violently frozen. And a highly massive army entirely of highly elite forensic accountants was actively being highly aggressively dispatched entirely to highly meticulously audit absolutely every single pathetic penny he had absolutely ever highly actively touched. He was highly aggressively actively prevented, completely from confidently entering his absolute own massive office, completely by the highly strict building security. When he highly frantically attempted to urgently call Chloe Decker, her expensive number was completely, permanently disconnected. She had completely vanished. Her highly rapidly rising elite career, highly likely, completely, violently incinerated entirely. In the highly lethal blast radius entirely of his highly catastrophic downfall. He was completely, utterly ruined. Completely and highly absolutely entirely in exactly less than 12 highly agonizing hours. Meanwhile, Isabella was highly securely protected entirely in the highly silent, heavily fortified safety entirely of the highly massive estate, entirely of her loving father. She violently woke completely up, entirely in the highly beautiful room, entirely of her highly simple childhood. The highly bright morning sun, beautifully entering completely through the large windows, perfectly overlooking highly beautiful, rolling green hills. A highly stark, beautiful contrast, completely to the highly suffocating, concrete canyons, entirely of her highly toxic married life. The massive world entirely into which she violently woke, completely up, absolutely was not the highly exact same exactly. One, entirely, in which she had peacefully fallen deeply asleep. Her expensive phone was a highly constant, annoying buzz, entirely of highly fake messages, completely from highly toxic people. She absolutely hadn't clearly heard completely from entirely in agonizing years. Absolutely all highly pathetically offering highly belated, fake congratulations and highly fawning pathetic support. She completely, utterly ignored absolutely all, entirely of them. She successfully found her loving father entirely in his highly massive office. A highly cavernous, massive room, heavily lined, completely with heavy books, intensely looking directly at a highly small, beautifully framed photo perfectly on his massive desk. It was officially, entirely, of her loving mother. Helena, a highly beautiful woman, completely with a highly vibrant, beautiful smile and piercing eyes, entirely of the highly exact same, warm brown, exactly as Isabella. "I am incredibly, profoundly sorry," Isabella stated incredibly softly, her beautiful voice absolutely still incredibly hoarse. "I absolutely should have intensely listened completely to you." Arthur smoothly turned completely around, his handsome expression completely unreadable. "No, Isabella, I am officially the exact one who highly sincerely apologizes. I completely, catastrophically failed you. You absolutely did not highly tragically fail me. You miraculously saved me." "I miraculously saved you completely from a highly lethal fire that I highly actively helped to completely ignite," he stated, his deep voice incredibly heavy, completely with a highly massive guilt that she had absolutely never, ever clearly heard completely before. He highly gently gestured entirely for her to safely sit perfectly in exactly one entirely of the highly soft, expensive leather armchairs. "There is absolutely something highly massive that you highly desperately need to explicitly know. The highly absolute reason exactly why I highly meticulously hid absolutely everything completely from you. The highly absolute reason exactly why we peacefully lived so incredibly quietly." He took a massive, incredibly deep breath. "Your loving mother. Her highly tragic death absolutely was not a highly simple, pathetic car accident. It was a highly lethal message. I was actively entirely in the absolute middle, entirely, of a highly brutal, hostile corporate acquisition, entirely of a highly rival company. The elite CEO was a highly dangerous, terrifying man, explicitly named Julian Croft. He highly aggressively played incredibly dirty. Exactly 1 short week, completely before the highly official, final shareholder vote. The expensive car entirely of Helena was violently forced completely off the dark road, completely by a highly massive truck. The elite police highly pathetically ruled it a highly tragic accident, a highly pathetic problem completely in the brake lines, but I profoundly knew. My highly elite security team highly successfully found highly undeniable evidence that the highly critical tubing had absolutely been highly intentionally cut. There was absolutely nothing that I could highly possibly successfully prove entirely in federal court. But I profoundly knew that Croft was perfectly behind it. He was actively sending a highly lethal message. My beautiful family was officially a highly massive target. Isabella intensely stared directly at him, her fragile heart violently aching. She had violently cried completely for her loving mother, her entire massive life, but absolutely always highly genuinely believed that it was a highly tragic, random, massive event. After she highly tragically died, Arthur aggressively continued, his deep voice incredibly thick, completely with massive emotion. I highly successfully won the highly hostile acquisition. I completely, violently crushed the massive company entirely of Croft and completely ruined him highly personally. But it was a highly hollow, pathetic victory. I intensely looked directly at you, so incredibly small and highly innocent, and I fiercely made a highly absolute vow. Absolutely no one would absolutely ever highly maliciously use you entirely to highly successfully get directly to me completely ever again. So, Arthur Sinclair, the highly terrifying billionaire, completely ceased entirely to highly actively exist. I miraculously became a highly reclusive, pathetic consultant. I highly meticulously built a highly impenetrable wall, entirely of absolute anonymity, completely around us, completely around you. I highly genuinely thought that exactly if you peacefully lived a highly normal, beautiful life, completely without the highly flashy trappings entirely of highly immense wealth, you would absolutely be completely safe. You would absolutely be completely free, entirely, to miraculously find absolutely someone who fiercely loved you entirely for you. Absolutely not entirely for your highly famous name or massive money. He intensely looked directly at her, his piercing eyes completely full entirely of highly profound, massive regret, but highly desperately attempting entirely to fiercely protect you completely from exactly one highly specific type entirely of highly lethal predator. I highly tragically left you completely, utterly defenseless, completely against absolutely another. Elliot absolutely did not fiercely want the highly massive Sinclair fortune entirely, because he absolutely never, ever completely knew it highly actively existed. He absolutely only fiercely wanted a highly beautiful, gentle, pathetic wife, completely with a highly respectable, but absolutely not highly intimidating family connection. He fiercely wanted absolutely someone he could highly toxically control. My highly absolute secrecy, my highly massive lie, flawlessly made you the highly perfect, pathetic target entirely for a highly toxic man, exactly like him. I'm so incredibly, profoundly sorry, Bela. The highly massive revelation completely washed completely over Isabella. A highly massive wave entirely of highly profound understanding and pure sadness. The highly freezing distance entirely of her loving father, his highly silent, quiet nature, his highly intense aversion entirely to the highly blinding spotlight. It absolutely wasn't highly toxic rejection entirely of her, but a highly desperate, misguided, pathetic attempt entirely to fiercely protect her. He had highly agonizingly carried exactly this highly terrifying secret. Exactly this highly massive burden entirely of pure sorrow and massive guilt completely alone. Entirely for absolutely all these agonizing years. She confidently stood completely up, completely from her comfortable chair, and confidently walked directly to him, highly lovingly wrapping her soft arms completely around his broad shoulders. He was a highly powerful, formidable, massive man who had literally just completely, violently shaken the highly solid foundations entirely of the highly elite Polistana society, but entirely in exactly that highly specific moment. He was absolutely just a highly grieving husband and a highly terrified father who highly tragically feared he had highly catastrophically failed his beautiful daughter. "You absolutely did not highly tragically fail me, Dad," she whispered incredibly softly, gently resting her delicate head perfectly on absolutely his. "You highly generously gave me a highly real, beautiful childhood. You highly generously gave me a highly fragile chance entirely to absolutely be a highly normal person. Absolutely not a highly flashy headline. And exactly last highly terrifying night, exactly last night, you beautifully gave me my beautiful life completely back." He finally highly lovingly put his strong arms completely around her, fiercely holding his beautiful daughter and his highly innocent, unborn grandson. The highly massive future entirely of his highly prestigious legacy. The highly impenetrable walls he had highly meticulously built, entirely for agonizing decades, were finally, completely, violently, falling completely down. The highly terrifying secret was completely out, and the massive world would completely, violently, change completely forever. But exactly now, entirely for the absolute first time, they would highly bravely face it completely together. Arthur revealed his secret past and why he hid his wealth. Did he make the right decision to protect Isabella? Tell us your thoughts below. The transfer of power in the highly agonizing week that seamlessly followed. A highly elite team, entirely of the absolute most highly formidable lawyers, entirely in the massive world. Absolutely all, completely on the highly massive payroll, entirely of Arthur Sinclair. Highly aggressively descended completely upon the highly pathetic life, entirely of Isabella. They confidently arrived heavily armed, completely, with highly meticulously pre-prepared divorce petitions. Highly strict asset seizure notices entirely for Elliot, and a highly massive mountain entirely of highly complex corporate documents that flawlessly represented the highly golden keys entirely to the massive kingdom entirely of Sinclair Global. The massive world highly anxiously expected a highly bloody bloodbath, a highly messy, highly public, brutal divorce, exactly where the highly betrayed wife would highly aggressively take her highly toxic husband completely for absolutely every single absolute last pathetic penny. But Isabella fiercely wanted absolutely something completely else. She fiercely wanted absolute closure. Absolutely not entirely just highly toxic revenge. Exactly 2 agonizing weeks completely after, exactly that highly fateful, explosive night, she highly confidently agreed entirely to successfully meet Elliot. Absolutely not entirely in the highly sterile office, entirely of a highly expensive lawyer, but entirely in the highly vast, completely empty luxury penthouse that they had exactly once happily shared. He was a completely, utterly changed man. The highly petulant, toxic arrogance had completely, permanently gone. Flawlessly replaced completely by a highly desperate, completely haunted, highly pathetic look. He had highly visibly lost massive weight, and the highly expensive bespoke suit highly pathetically hung completely on him, exactly like a highly cheap shroud. He was confidently standing perfectly near the highly massive floor-to-ceiling windows, intensely looking completely out directly at a massive city that absolutely no longer legally belonged completely to him. "Isabella," he stated, his deep voice incredibly hoarse. "They violently took absolutely everything. The highly massive accounts, the expensive cars, absolutely even the highly exclusive club memberships. Isabella confidently stood incredibly calmly, perfectly near the heavy door, her soft hand gently resting perfectly on her massive stomach. She profoundly felt absolutely zero pathetic pity. Absolutely only a highly profound, deep sense entirely of absolute finality. They were absolutely never, ever officially yours entirely to absolutely begin completely with, Elliot. They were absolutely all highly generously borrowed completely from my loving father. He smoothly turned entirely to fiercely face her, his piercing eyes highly pathetically pleading. I profoundly know that exactly what I violently did was completely unforgivable. Chloe, the highly toxic things that I explicitly said. I was an absolute highly pathetic idiot, Bela. I was completely, violently, blinded completely by blinding ambition. But I fiercely loved you. In the absolute beginning, I highly, truly, genuinely loved you. Loved? She asked, her beautiful voice incredibly clear and highly firm. Did you fiercely love me? Or did you fiercely love the highly pathetic idea entirely of me? The highly perfect, highly silent, pathetic wife who would absolutely never, ever highly bravely challenge you. Who would visually look incredibly good, completely on your strong arm, and absolutely never, ever highly audaciously question your highly arrogant authority. You absolutely did not fiercely want an elite partner, Elliot. You fiercely wanted a highly pathetic possession. He aggressively took exactly one massive step directly toward her. We can miraculously fix exactly this. We officially possess an innocent child completely on the highly massive way. Your highly powerful father, he highly aggressively did exactly this, entirely to highly ruthlessly teach me a highly massive lesson. I profoundly understand. I have completely learned. Explicitly tell him that I have completely learned. We can highly beautifully start completely over. It was exactly then that Isabella finally completely understood the highly terrifying depth entirely of his absolute delusion. He absolutely still highly pathetically saw her exactly as a highly useful intermediary, a highly convenient conduit directly to the highly massive power entirely of her loving father. He absolutely did not vividly see her completely at absolutely all. She smoothly reached directly into her expensive purse and flawlessly pulled completely out exactly one single, highly official document. It absolutely wasn't a highly massive lawsuit. It was a highly simple, one-page agreement. She gently placed it perfectly on the highly polished marble coffee table. This is officially a highly simple divorce settlement, Elliot. It has absolutely already been highly officially signed completely by M.E. He highly frantically rushed entirely to highly desperately read it, his piercing eyes frantically scanning the highly official page incredibly frantically. What exactly is exactly this? It explicitly says that I highly generously get entirely to successfully keep the expensive watch and the highly cheap art completely from my massive office. Absolutely nothing significantly more. This is an absolute toxic joke. It absolutely is not a highly toxic joke, Isabella stated incredibly calmly. You highly toxically explicitly told me exactly once that I absolutely should not safely stay completely, violently tied completely to highly pathetic, outdated assets. I am highly actively following your highly excellent advice. I am highly freely releasing you completely from our beautiful marriage. I am absolutely not highly aggressively suing you. I am absolutely not highly maliciously dragging you completely through the highly strict federal courts. I am highly simply, highly generously letting you completely go. The highly elite legal team entirely of my loving father will highly efficiently handle the highly absolute dissolution entirely of Vance Properties. As entirely for me, I fiercely want absolutely nothing completely from you, and I am absolutely not highly generously giving you absolutely anything. You can highly happily successfully keep your highly pathetic watch. He intensely looked directly at her, completely dumbfounded. He had highly anxiously expected a highly violent fight. Loud screams, highly dramatic declarations entirely of massive war. He was highly meticulously prepared entirely for massive war. He absolutely was not highly meticulously prepared entirely for exactly this highly quiet, completely absolute dismissal, entirely to be highly toxically treated exactly as so incredibly, highly insignificant that he wasn't absolutely even highly actively worth, highly bravely fighting completely for. You are highly simply completely erasing me, he whispered incredibly softly. The absolute entire massive weight, entirely, of his highly absolute irrelevance finally, completely violently falling completely upon him. No, Elliot, Isabella stated, smoothly turning entirely to confidently leave. You absolutely never, ever, highly truly, genuinely, were completely here, entirely, to absolutely begin completely with. She highly ruthlessly left him completely in the highly empty, massive penthouse. A highly pathetic ghost, entirely in a highly fake life, that had absolutely never, ever, truly, genuinely, been absolutely his. As the highly secure elevator smoothly descended, Isabella profoundly felt a highly beautiful lightness that she absolutely hadn't miraculously experienced entirely in agonizing years. It absolutely wasn't the highly toxic thrill entirely of absolute victory. It was the highly beautiful, pure peace entirely of absolute liberation. That exact night, she highly successfully met completely with her loving father and David Brown, the highly elite CEO entirely of Sinclair Global, entirely in the highly imposing, massive headquarters entirely of the massive company. A highly towering building she had highly casually passed exactly 1,000 massive times, completely without absolutely even profoundly knowing that it highly legally belonged completely to her beautiful family. The highly massive boardroom was incredibly intimidating. Absolutely all freezing glass and solid steel, completely with a highly breathtaking view that beautifully stretched completely from the highly busy waterfront directly to the absolute center entirely of the massive city. The highly elite board is completely prepared entirely to highly officially ratify your highly coveted position exactly as absolute President Isabella, David Brown highly respectfully stated. Your highly powerful father and I can highly expertly guide you completely through. Absolutely, of course. You can highly freely, absolutely, be exactly as highly actively involved or completely distant exactly as you highly fiercely desire. Her loving father fiercely nodded. You absolutely do not highly actively have entirely to actively do absolutely anything that you absolutely do not fiercely want to, Bella. You can highly successfully set completely up a highly massive foundation. Highly passionately focus completely entirely on elite philanthropy. The massive money is completely yours entirely to highly freely actively do exactly what you highly genuinely think is absolute best. Isabella intensely looked completely out directly at the massive city, beautifully spread completely out, completely down below. A highly massive universe entirely of bright lights and highly infinite possibilities. Her entire massive life. highly powerful others, had highly actively made highly massive choices completely for her. Her loving father, highly protectively, chose absolute secrecy entirely to fiercely protect her. Elliot highly toxically chose absolute control entirely to violently possess her. Now, entirely for the absolute first time, the highly massive choice was officially hers. No, she stated, her beautiful voice loudly resonating completely with a highly brand new, absolute strength that completely surprised absolutely even completely herself. I absolutely do not fiercely want to actively be a highly silent, pathetic president, and elite philanthropy absolutely is not completely enough. She smoothly turned entirely to fiercely face them, her piercing eyes incredibly clear and highly determined. Sinclair Global is a highly ruthless, massive company. Dad, I have highly meticulously read the highly complex reports. You highly successfully built exactly this massive empire completely by actively being a highly lethal shark. I highly profoundly respect exactly what you highly successfully built. But I absolutely cannot highly pathetically be exactly you. She took a massive, incredibly deep breath. I fiercely want to absolutely be the elite CEO. Absolutely not. Entirely. Just completely in highly official name. I fiercely want to highly aggressively command exactly this massive company. I fiercely want to completely, violently, change it completely. From the absolute inside, completely out. We highly officially possess the absolute power entirely to absolutely be a highly massive force entirely for absolute good. Absolutely not entirely. Just entirely for highly toxic profit. I fiercely want to highly massively invest entirely in highly advanced sustainable energy. Miraculously create highly fair labor practices, and highly successfully build a highly massive charitable foundation that is officially a highly central, massive part entirely of our highly core business model. Absolutely not entirely just a highly pathetic tax deduction. I fiercely want to miraculously build a highly massive legacy that our beautiful family, my innocent son, can highly proudly absolutely be incredibly proud entirely of. David Brown visually looked completely, utterly stunned. Arthur Sinclair intensely looked directly at his beautiful daughter, and entirely for the absolute first time vividly saw absolutely not the highly innocent little girl who highly desperately needed entirely to absolutely be fiercely protected, but the highly visionary, incredibly powerful, beautiful woman that his highly beloved wife, Helena, had absolutely always perfectly been. A highly slow, incredibly proud, beautiful smile, beautifully spread completely across his handsome face. Well then, Arthur stated, his deep voice heavily overflowing completely with absolute pride. It highly apparently seems that you officially possess a highly massive board meeting entirely to highly aggressively command. Isabella is taking over as CEO. Do you think her new ethical vision for the company will succeed? Tell us below. The Rise of the Phoenix. Exactly 1 beautiful year, completely later. The highly glamorous setting absolutely wasn't a highly exclusive red carpet, but the brilliantly gleaming, highly ultra-modern, beautiful lobby entirely of the highly recently inaugurated Helena Sinclair Children's Hospital. The highly absolute flagship project entirely of the massive Sinclair Global Foundation. The heavy air violently vibrated. Absolutely not completely, with the highly annoying sound entirely of highly aggressive camera shutters, but completely with the highly genuine, pure emotion and absolute gratitude entirely of highly dedicated doctors. highly vulnerable patients, and highly grateful city officials. In the absolute beating center entirely of absolutely everything was officially Isabella Sinclair. She was absolutely no longer the highly timid, pathetic woman, highly cowardly, hiding perfectly behind her highly arrogant husband. She was incredibly poised, highly confident, and completely, utterly radiant, flawlessly dressed entirely in a highly precision-cut, bespoke power suit. She fiercely held her highly adorable 10-month-old biological son, Arthur Jr., AJ, perfectly on her delicate hip. The innocent son, completely with highly bright, incredibly curious eyes, was the highly constant, beautiful reminder entirely of exactly what she was highly aggressively building, and entirely for exactly who she was highly lovingly building it. She had highly agonizingly spent the absolute last beautiful year entirely in a highly brutal baptism, entirely of pure fire, highly meticulously learning absolutely every single highly complex facet entirely of the highly vast Sinclair massive empire. She brutally worked highly tirelessly, highly successfully earning the highly absolute respect entirely of the massive board. Absolutely not entirely, because completely of her highly famous name, but entirely because completely of her highly sharp intellect, absolute compassion, and completely unshakable, pure vision. She had highly successfully initiated highly sweeping, massive changes, highly aggressively divesting completely from highly exploitative, toxic industries, and highly generously pouring exactly billions directly into highly advanced green technology and highly ethical, massive ventures. The highly massive profits had highly initially violently dropped, highly aggressively causing massive panic completely among absolutely some highly conservative, older shareholders. But Isabella highly stubbornly maintained her highly absolute position. Now, completely with highly massive, brand new lucrative government contracts, entirely in highly advanced renewable energy, and a highly massive wave entirely of highly positive public sentiment. Sinclair Global was significantly more highly respected and significantly more highly lucrative than absolutely ever completely before. Her highly innovative model entirely of highly compassionate capitalism was actively, violently becoming a highly prominent case study entirely in highly prestigious elite business schools, after highly eloquently delivering a highly powerful, deeply touching speech, beautifully dedicating the massive hospital completely to the loving mother she literally barely intimately knew. Isabella was highly happily mingling completely with the highly elite guests. She smoothly moved completely with highly easy, beautiful grace, highly intelligently discussing highly complex pediatric oncology, completely with the highly elite chief of surgery, exactly one brief moment, and highly playfully making highly adorable funny faces, completely with her innocent son, the absolute next. She vividly saw her loving father completely across the massive room intensely watching her. He absolutely wasn't the highly gloomy, highly secret man entirely of her highly innocent youth. The massive, crushing weight entirely of the highly toxic past actively seemed to highly miraculously have completely lifted. He was beautifully smiling, a highly genuine, incredibly warm, beautiful smile, exactly as he highly playfully played peekaboo completely with his adorable grandson. He had miraculously found a highly brand new, beautiful purpose. Absolutely, not exactly, as the highly terrifying king entirely of the dark shadows, but exactly as a highly doting grandfather and an incredibly proud father. Significantly later, exactly when the highly exclusive event was beautifully winding completely down, Isabella peacefully stood completely with her loving father, entirely in the highly beautiful rooftop garden, entirely of the massive hospital. The highly bright lights entirely of the massive city, beautifully twinkling completely below, exactly like a highly magical fallen constellation. A jay was peacefully deeply sleeping entirely in his expensive stroller. Perfectly right, perfectly next, completely to them. Your loving mother would absolutely be so incredibly highly proud entirely of you, Bella, Arthur stated, his deep voice incredibly quiet. You flawlessly possess her highly absolute strength, her beautiful heart. I flawlessly learned completely from the absolute best, Isabella beautifully responded, fiercely squeezing his massive hand. Completely from absolutely both entirely of you, of a highly sudden notification loudly pinged completely on her expensive phone. It was officially the highly urgent news alert. She highly casually took a highly brief look. The highly massive headline loudly read, Highly arrogant fallen magnate, Elliot Vance, highly legally sentenced entirely to exactly 18 agonizing months, entirely for highly illegal securities fraud. The highly detailed article, highly meticulously detailed exactly how the highly rigorous forensic audit highly successfully uncovered agonizing years entirely of highly illegal financial crimes. A highly fragile house entirely of highly cheap cards, so incredibly, highly rotten, that it was a highly massive miracle that it had highly successfully stood perfectly upright. He was a completely, utterly forgotten man. A highly pathetic footnote entirely in her highly epic story. She profoundly felt absolutely nothing. Absolutely no toxic anger. Absolutely no highly smug satisfaction. Absolutely only a highly clinical, incredibly distant, absolute pity. She highly casually archived the highly urgent notification completely, without a single second thought, and smoothly put the expensive phone completely away. He was officially the highly toxic past. She was highly aggressively actively looking directly at the highly massive future. She intensely looked directly out, directly at the highly beautiful skyline, directly at the highly infinite, massive river, entirely of bright headlights and highly imposing, towering buildings. Exactly one agonizing year, completely ago. Exactly this massive city was officially her highly terrifying prison. Exactly now, it was officially her highly massive kingdom. Absolutely not a highly cold kingdom entirely of freezing glass and solid steel, but entirely of absolute hope, massive legacy, and completely limitless, beautiful possibilities. She absolutely was not Isabella Vance, the highly publicly humiliated, pathetic wife. Nor was she absolutely just Isabella Sinclair, the highly terrifying billionaire heiress. She was officially Isabella, loving mother, absolute leader, brilliant survivor, and intensely looking completely out directly at the highly beautiful, limitless horizon. She profoundly knew completely with highly absolute, complete certainty that her highly epic story was absolutely only highly actively beginning. The phantom threat, the highly successful following 18 agonizing months, completely after the highly grand inauguration entirely of the Helena Sinclair Children's Hospital, were an absolute, highly brilliant period, entirely of completely unprecedented, massive success. And significantly, more highly importantly, highly profound, beautiful peace, entirely for Isabella. Sinclair Global, completely under her highly brilliant leadership, had miraculously become a highly flawless model, entirely of highly modern corporate responsibility. The highly valuable share price violently skyrocketing flawlessly, based completely on highly ethical innovation and highly impeccable, pristine public image. Her beautiful life had miraculously found a highly beautiful rhythm that she deeply cherished. Highly peaceful early mornings, completely. With her innocent son, Jay, whose absolute first highly precious words and highly wobbly, hesitant steps beautifully filled the luxury penthouse completely, with highly pure joy that she absolutely never, ever completely knew. Highly demanding but incredibly rewarding beautiful days entirely at the massive office. Highly aggressively shaping the massive world significantly better, completely, through highly critical work. And highly quiet, beautiful nights completely with her loving father, who had highly seamlessly, beautifully settled completely into the highly wonderful role entirely of highly doting grandfather, the highly toxic ghosts entirely of Elliot Vance, and the highly humiliating red carpet had completely, beautifully faded, completely into a highly distant, miraculously, almost highly unbelievable memory. She absolutely was no longer a highly pathetic story. She was officially the absolute author. This highly brand new, beautiful stability was officially the highly absolute reason exactly why the absolute first, highly terrifying anomaly physically seemed so incredibly, completely shocking. It highly specifically concerned a highly small, but incredibly brilliant, elite German engineering company explicitly named Liqua, which had highly successfully developed a highly revolutionary, cutting-edge solar panel technology. It was a highly perfect, flawless acquisition, entirely for the highly advanced green energy division, entirely of Sinclair Global. Isabella had highly personally meticulously overseen the highly complex final negotiations. The highly massive deal was practically, completely closed. A highly official press release was absolutely already highly officially drafted. Then, exactly 48 agonizing hours, completely before the highly anticipated final signature. The highly elite board entirely of Liqua highly urgently convened a highly unexpected emergency meeting. A highly massive new offer had highly mysteriously appeared, highly apparently, completely out, entirely of absolute nowhere. A highly massive offer, so incredibly astronomically high, so incredibly, completely beyond the highly actual, real valuation entirely of the massive company that it violently bordered completely on the highly absurd. Liqua, highly legally obligated, completely by highly strict fiduciary duty, directly to their massive shareholders, officially possessed absolutely zero highly viable choice, absolutely, but entirely, to highly eagerly, accept. In the highly massive boardroom entirely of Sinclair Global, the highly tense mood was exactly one entirely of highly perplexed, massive frustration. Who exactly highly aggressively did exactly this? Isabella sharply asked, intensely looking directly at the highly somber faces entirely of the highly elite acquisitions team. Which exactly one entirely of our highly ruthless competitors officially possesses so incredibly much massive cash, entirely to highly recklessly burn entirely in a highly pathetic vanity play? David Brown, absolutely still her highly trusted elite. CEO, highly smoothly slid a highly advanced tablet completely across the highly massive solid oak table. Exactly that is officially the highly massive problem, Isabella. We honestly do not completely know. She intensely looked directly at the bright screen. The highly aggressive buyer was officially a highly recently registered, massive investment vehicle, highly explicitly named Phoenix Holdings. The highly terrifying name highly aggressively sent a highly small and highly unpleasant, freezing shiver completely down her fragile spine. A highly faint, toxic echo entirely of the highly explosive event, exactly where her beautiful life was completely, violently destroyed and miraculously rebuilt. Highly aggressively track exactly it, she violently ordered. I highly desperately want to explicitly know exactly who is perfectly behind at exactly that highly toxic name. I fiercely want to explicitly know entirely about the massive investors, entirely about the elite board, absolutely everything. For exactly one agonizing week, the absolute best, highly elite financial investigators entirely in the massive world. Highly brilliant men and beautiful women who could highly easily successfully find a highly lost pathetic reel completely inside a highly complex labyrinth entirely of highly secure offshore accounts. Brutally worked exactly 24 agonizing hours, a highly busy day. They highly frustratingly returned completely with absolutely nothing. Phoenix Holdings was an absolute, terrifying ghost. It was highly securely registered entirely in a highly strict non-disclosure jurisdiction. Highly massively funded, completely by a highly complex series entirely of highly untraceable bearer bonds, and highly meticulously layered completely through so incredibly many highly secure shell companies entirely in massive Panama, the highly secure Cayman Islands, and highly secretive Liechtenstein, that the highly complex trail completely, violently, went completely cold. It was an absolute, flawless masterclass, entirely in highly toxic corporate anonymity. The highly complex technique is incredibly, highly familiar, David Brown honestly admitted completely, with a highly grave expression. It is exactly the highly exact same massive level entirely of highly complex obfuscation that your loving father highly successfully used entirely to miraculously build the massive portfolio entirely in the highly early, difficult days. The highly heavy comment violently hung suspended completely in the heavy air. This absolutely was not a highly standard, pathetic corporate rival. This was absolutely someone who intimately knew their highly complex methods. Absolutely someone who highly aggressively played the highly exact same, highly ruthless, and incredibly intricate massive game that Arthur Sinclair had exactly once highly flawlessly mastered. The highly aggressive move absolutely wasn't entirely about elite business. It physically felt incredibly, highly personal. It was officially a highly lethal message. That exact night, Isabella safely brought the highly complex problem directly to her loving father. They sat peacefully, entirely in his massive study, a highly beautiful place that had miraculously transformed completely from the highly quiet refuge, entirely of a highly solitary man, directly into the absolute favorite, highly fun playroom, entirely of AJ. Completely with highly priceless first editions, peacefully sitting perfectly right, perfectly next, completely to highly colorful building blocks, while Isabella highly meticulously laid completely out the highly complex details entirely of the highly failed Liqua acquisition and the highly impenetrable, massive wall entirely of Phoenix Holdings. She vividly saw a highly brief flash, entirely of absolutely something highly terrifying, entirely in the piercing eyes, entirely of her loving father, that she had absolutely not vividly seen entirely in agonizing years. It absolutely wasn't pure anger or massive frustration. It was a highly freezing, completely chilling, absolute recognition. "Croft," Arthur highly toxically murmured. His deep voice a highly low, terrifying whisper. He confidently walked directly to the massive desk and highly rapidly typed, "Absolutely," something highly complex, completely into his highly secure private computer. He remained completely, utterly silent, entirely for a highly incredibly long, massive time. His handsome face brilliantly illuminated completely by the highly bright glow entirely of the bright screen. The highly heavy silence violently stretched, incredibly thick, completely, with a highly massive tension that actively made the highly fine hairs perfectly on the soft arms entirely of Isabella violently stand completely on absolute end. "Dad, what exactly is it?" He finally smoothly turned entirely to fiercely face her, and his beautiful expression was completely, utterly terrifying. Absolutely all the highly warm warmth had completely, permanently gone. Flawlessly replaced completely by the highly hardened, freezing face entirely of the highly ruthless, absolute titan that he exactly once, absolutely, was. "It is officially him," Arthur stated, his deep voice a highly grave, terrifying whisper. "I absolutely should have profoundly known. I absolutely should have highly meticulously made completely 100% sure." "Who exactly?" Isabella highly aggressively pressed, her massive heart aggressively beginning to violently race. "The exact man whose highly massive company I completely, violently destroyed completely after the highly tragic death entirely of your loving mother." Arthur explicitly said the heavy words exactly like highly sharp chips, entirely of freezing ice. "A highly terrifying man that I highly ruthlessly left, completely, with absolutely nothing, completely, but his absolute own highly toxic hatred. His highly specific name is officially Julian Croft." Isabella physically felt all the hot blood completely, violently leave her pale face. Julian Croft. The highly terrifying name entirely from the highly tragic story. The highly faceless, toxic villain who highly maliciously orchestrated the highly brutal murder entirely of her loving mother. "But you highly explicitly said that you completely, violently ruined him. I highly genuinely thought he had completely, permanently disappeared. I completely, violently ruined his highly public, pathetic life," Arthur highly gently corrected. His piercing eyes incredibly dark, completely with massive regret. "I violently took his massive company, his pristine reputation, his massive fortune. I highly ruthlessly left him an absolute, highly toxic pariah, but I highly foolishly let him actively live. I highly arrogantly thought that highly pathetically disappearing completely into highly pathetic obscurity was a highly massive punishment, significantly more highly cruel than massive death. I was incredibly arrogant. I highly catastrophically underestimated his highly terrifying capacity entirely for absolute patience, entirely for highly toxic revenge." He highly aggressively gestured completely back directly to the bright screen. Croft was absolutely always highly toxically obsessed completely with highly ancient mythology. The highly epic story entirely of the highly magical phoenix beautifully rising completely from the highly toxic ashes was officially the highly powerful symbol entirely of his absolute first massive company. He absolutely is not entirely just completely back, entirely an elite business, Bela. He is highly aggressively announcing completely to me. The highly complex pieces completely, violently, clicked flawlessly into highly perfect place, completely with a highly horrific, absolute clarity. The highly absurdly high massive offer absolutely wasn't entirely about successfully acquiring a highly advanced solar company. It was entirely about highly proudly showing the highly powerful Sinclairs that he highly absolutely could. The highly impenetrable, secure shell companies absolutely weren't entirely for highly pathetic anonymity. They were a highly direct, toxic mockery entirely of the highly flawless Sinclair method. It absolutely wasn't a highly pathetic business play. It was the absolute first highly aggressive move entirely in a highly massive war. He is highly actively rebuilding completely himself, Arthur aggressively continued, his deep voice incredibly somber. Brutally working completely in the highly dark shadows. Highly likely, completely through highly illegal black market massive deals and highly toxic connections that I highly successfully dismantled agonizing years completely ago. He has absolutely been highly patiently waiting entirely for the absolute right, perfect, massive moment entirely to highly aggressively strike. And we highly foolishly gave exactly it directly to him. What exactly do you explicitly mean? Isabella whispered incredibly softly. My highly explosive speech entirely at the highly exclusive event. Your highly massive ascension directly to elite CEO. The highly epic story was completely global. Arthur explicitly explained, the highly deep self-hatred incredibly clear, entirely in his deep voice. We completely, violently, put you entirely in the highly blinding spotlight, Bela. We completely, violently put the highly terrifying name Sinclair completely back perfectly on the highly massive world stage. For a highly terrifying man, exactly like Croft, a highly toxic man, highly maliciously nursing a highly toxic grudge, entirely of exactly 20 agonizing years, vividly seeing you, the beautiful daughter entirely of Helena, highly miraculously thriving, entirely in the highly coveted chair, entirely of my absolute power, absolutely must have highly toxically been the highly ultimate, absolute provocation. Arthur confidently walked directly to Isabella, his strong hands heavily resting perfectly on her fragile shoulders, his piercing eyes violently piercing completely through hers. The blinding fear that she vividly saw perfectly there absolutely wasn't entirely for him, but entirely for her and her innocent son. He absolutely does not fiercely want the massive company. He absolutely does not fiercely want my massive money. Arthur intensely looked completely directly entirely into the piercing eyes, entirely of his beautiful daughter. He fiercely wants our highly massive legacy, Isabella. He fiercely wants you. And he will absolutely not completely stop completely until he has completely, violently, burned absolutely everything we have highly successfully built, completely back directly to the highly cold ground. The highly cozy, warm heat entirely of the massive office, highly suddenly physically felt exactly like a highly freezing, terrifying tomb. The highly terrifying ghost that highly maliciously haunted the highly toxic past, entirely of her loving father, was absolutely no longer, absolutely just, a highly pathetic memory. He was perfectly here. He was incredibly real, and he was highly aggressively actively coming completely directly after them. Isabella intensely looked directly at the highly colorful toys, carelessly scattered perfectly on the hard floor. Deeply thought entirely about her highly innocent son, peacefully sleeping highly quietly, entirely, in the expensive crib, completely upstairs, and a highly brand new, massive feeling, completely, violently, washed completely over her. flawlessly eclipsing the blinding fear. It was a highly cold, fiercely protective, absolute fury that she highly instantly flawlessly recognized. It was officially the highly terrifying Sinclair Fury. It was exactly the exact same highly massive fire that highly aggressively fueled her loving father entirely to miraculously build a massive empire. And exactly the exact same highly absolute determination that highly miraculously permitted her entirely to highly bravely rebuild her beautiful life. Julian Croft highly arrogantly thought he was highly actively hunting the highly pathetic daughter entirely of a highly terrifying ghost. He was highly actively about to completely, horrifyingly, discover that he was highly actively hunting an absolute, untouchable queen. What an absolutely explosive, heart-stopping twist. Julian Croft is back for revenge against the Sinclair family. Do you fiercely think Isabella and Arthur can defeat him? Or is their empire in serious danger? Drop your fierce thoughts and predictions in the comments below. Please don't forget to smash that like button to support Isabella's upcoming war. Share this thrilling story, and subscribe to our channel with notifications on so you don't miss the epic showdown. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.